Hi, everyone. My name is Blake Chastain, and this is my show, The Good Books, where I talk to authors about their books and why they're relevant and why you should read them today. My first guest on this show is Matthew Taylor, and I'm super excited to get to the interview, but I did just want to acknowledge that I am starting to post my interviews on YouTube and am beginning to really start to dive directly into video production in addition to the general audio and podcast production that I've been doing for years through Exvangelical. This is a new show, but I'm very excited to be talking to authors across a variety of genres, and I hope you enjoy it. If you want to follow along, please like and subscribe on YouTube and elsewhere as the show gets added to other podcast directories. But without further ado, let's get to my interview with Matthew Taylor. My guest today is Dr. Matthew Taylor. He is the senior Protestant scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, where he specializes in American Christianity, American Islam, Christian extremism, and religious politics. His new book is The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy. Matthew, welcome to the Good Books.
Thank you for having me here, Blake.
I'm really eager to talk to you about your work and your outlook on the situation that we just have in front of us and sort of all around us right now. But in keeping with sort of the tradition of my interviews, I do want to sort of ground our talk a little bit in your personal biography before we get into your professional work, which you do also highlight a bit of that biography at the start of your book. You were raised in evangelical circles, correct? So I'm just curious what your sort of initial religious background was like, and then what drew you to studying religion professionally.
Yeah, so I was definitely raised evangelical. If you're familiar with John MacArthur, my dad was on pastoral staff at John MacArthur's church up until about a few months before I was born. So
Oh,
that's
wow.
kind of the world I came from. My parents were very disillusioned with that experience, living with the certainty, the dogmatism of John MacArthur, and then kind of being more or less forced out of that space because they disagreed with him on some things. So my family actually lived in Washington State on a commune, on a Christian commune for a couple of years.
Oh,
Was
wow.
was a strange experience. And then we bounced around to a lot of different kinds of churches, Pentecostal, Vineyard, evangelical, free. I mean, Foursquare. There was a range of identities and experiences. And then I got involved when I went to college. I went to the University of California, Irvine, got involved with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
And really that was a very formative experience for me. Worked for InterVarsity for 7 years doing campus ministry. Then was wound up going to seminary while I was working for InterVarsity and just falling in love with academia, falling in love with theology, falling in love with studying again. And also discovered while I was at an evangelical seminary that I would no longer call myself an evangelical. And so,
Yeah.
and I also discovered I was just fascinated with Islam.
Mm.
But most of the people in my courses, Fuller, who were studying Islam, were all in training to become missionaries. And I realized I don't really want to convert Muslims, but I really like talking to them. And I feel like I have a lot to learn from them. And so I'm going and doing a PhD in Muslim Christian dialogue and religious pluralism, Georgetown
Mm.
University, and then landed a job in interreligious dialogue here at the Institute for Islamic Christian and Jewish Studies.
And I'm gonna pull on that thread just a little bit, just because I think that's fascinating. So, what was there a very distinct difference between the sort of like missiology or trying to convert Muslims and maybe what you might call interfaith dialogue or interreligious dialogue that you might find in another sort of institution or practice?
So I would say that even that was part of my leaving evangelicalism. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
in many ways, definitional to an evangelical identity. At least every evangelical identity that I experienced was you were to convert people, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's
Right.
it's it's in the title, right? And
Yeah.
I just I came to the point where I didn't have a problem with people choosing to convert, But then again, I don't have a problem with people choosing to convert to Islam or Judaism or Buddhism or Hinduism. I think people really need to have a level of autonomy, and just realizing the certainty upon which I had built a lot of those efforts to convert people was a little bit on a false foundation. I realized I didn't
Mm.
even really know the theology that I was trying to convince people of. And the more theology I studied, the more complicated theology became, and the more
Mm.
grounded in this bigger Christian tradition that was much more capacious and wide and open. And I felt over and over again that I was stuck in a cul-de-sac within evangelicalism, especially when it came to interreligious dialogue. And place like Fuller, there were interesting resources and conversations about Islam, but it always came back to you need to convert the Muslims. And
Mm.
it was interesting because I was even observing similar dynamics within Islam. That there is kind of an evangelical strain of Islam, you could say, that's focused on converting folks, and just seeing the stories Muslim converts would tell about their conversion experiences, how much that paralleled Christian conversion
Oh, wow.
stories. I think it tripled the waters of my mind a little bit to think like maybe I don't know everything that I think I know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. You had quite a variety of evangelical experiences. Would you characterize any of them like um any of those experiences as having like a charismatic or Pentecostal aspect to them when you were in all of these various evangelical or adjacent spaces, whether in your childhood or adolescence or after you were going through your studies?
Yeah, there was definitely a charismatic edge to a lot of the experiences that I had. I mean, I grew up in Southern California, and if you
Hmm.
know anything about the history of Pentecostalism and charismatic Christianity in the United States,
Right.
Southern California really was, and is still today, hub for. I mean, in Southern California, evangelicalism is distinct, I would say, from other
Hmm.
experiences of evangelicalism in the country. I come to discover, even in just studying evangelicalism, just how much there's an element of provincialism in most evangelical experiences. Everyone thinks like, oh, I grew up evangelical, and so I understand evangelicalism. And then realizing, like, if you grow up in the South, as compared with the Midwest, as compared with the
Yeah.
Northeast, as compared with the
Yeah.
Pacific Northwest, as compared with Southern California. Like those are all very, very different styles of evangelicalism, cultures of evangelicalism. I think
Hmm.
the soup of evangelicalism that I was in California very much had a charismatic edge to it. Even in InterVarsity, which is a non-denominational parachurch ministry, there was a strong charismatic tendency, both around spiritual warfare, around speaking in tongues, within InterVarsity. And a lot of the charismatic experiences that I had were a part of even my ministry life. Um, Coming to realize, even in the course of my research, oh wow, a lot of the stuff that I'm researching and writing about, I was very, very close to. I was like with within a couple degrees of separation, even from some of the people that I study who wound up being a part of January 6th and Christian Trumpism. A lot of that actually did come out of Southern California and circles that I was not necessarily in, but I was adjacent to.
Right. Yeah. And that's I really I appreciate that point because I mean I primarily come from like Wesleyan sort of holiness type things like from mainline slash evangelical United Methodist to Wesleyan to other sort of personal experiences in those spaces, and it's very distinct and different than charismatic sort of things. And I had friends, yeah, I would have singular sorts of experiences in these types of spaces, but they were the exception and not the rule to my personal religious experience. And so, like I've always sort of felt like this a little bit of an outsider to that aspect of religious experience, even within evangelical and charismatic spaces, because it just was not something that I could access or experience myself. That was actually one of the things I appreciated about your book is that within the introduction, you really take uh, a lot of care to make some distinctions between evangelicalism writ large and the sort of idiosyncrasies of these types of charismatic and Pentecostal movements that you write about in the violent take it by force. I was wondering if you could highlight a few of those and some of the things that are important distinctions between these more charismatic movements and what people may even like with these regional cultural distinctions that you already talked about, the evangelicalism they may have in their mind.
Sure. Yeah. And this is the reality in the limitations of our vocabulary in American Christianity. We have these kind of fixed buckets we tend to sort things
Mm-hmm.
into. Okay, here are evangelicals, here are mainline Protestants, here's historically black, here's Catholic, right? And to think that those are fixed categories
Mm-hmm.
um, are themselves kind of hermetically sealed from each other. The charismatic Pentecostal layer of identity kind of transcends and intersects with all of those in interesting ways. So let me do a little history, and then I can talk about particularly evangelicals.
Sure.
Because starting in the beginning of the 20th century, you have the emergence of Pentecostalism. In the U.S., it's very much centered in Southern California around the Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
Globally, it's exploding at the same time, almost concomitantly. All at the same time, you have these movements kind of emerging. Some of them coming out of these Wesleyan holiness strands, and there's just this energy and this verve, especially around the phenomenon of speaking in tongues, which most Christians had assumed was something that was described in the New Testament, had no modern experience of it. And so there's just this fervor and excitement around Pentecostalism, this new kind of ecstatic spirituality um, is somewhat coming out of these strands of kind of Methodist and holiness, thinking about the perfection of possibility of perfection among Christians and what the experience of that perfection would feel like. Then in middle of the 20th century, especially around the 1960s, that energy of Pentecostalism jumps out of Pentecostalism into sections of mainline Protestantism and Catholicism. That's called the Charismatic Renewal. Starts within the Episcopal Church and then within Protestantism and spreads from there. But then you have huge swaths of Roman Catholicism today globally that are charismatic. Even Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court just came out of charismatic Catholic community.
Mm-hmm.
This was all happening in the 1960s, right? As you have this kind of ferment within the society as a whole. Then out of the 1960s and 1970s, you have the Jesus People movement that was itself what
Mm-hmm.
not entirely charismatic, overwhelmingly charismatic within its spirituality, and really fuels the rise of this third strand, you could say, of the charismatic Pentecostal movements, and that is this independent charismatic, this non-denominational charismatic strand that has really risen to the fore more recently, and that's really the focus of my book, are these non-denominational charismatics who I think even the term non-denominational can be kind of misleading, though, because it implies that there's it's amorphous and disorganized, where the reality is within the non-denominational charismatic circles, there all these lateral works of relationships and connections and theology and media
Mm-hmm.
bridge among all these non-denominational movements. And there's also alternative governance models, and that's really what the New Apostolic Reformation is that it's an alternative church governance model at the start that then becomes a political movement. The focus at the beginning really is about trying to create an alternative to denominations. And many of the leaders of New Apostolic Reformation and this independent charismatic space were shaped by the Jesus movement, Jesus People, which was this kind of ex-hippie, kind of conversionist, exciting movement in the late 60s and early 70s, centered in California. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's been a real growing, and this is actually the only form of Christianity that's growing in the United States are these non-denominational charismatics, and they're growing really quickly, actually. And globally, um, experts estimate there were about 44 million independent charismatics globally in 1970. By 2020, it was up to 312 million. So you're talking about a portion Christianity globally that is roughly doubling in size every 20 years, which is just an
Wow.
astronomical growth rate for any religious movement. So there's something about this charismatic spirituality and this kind of experiential, ecstatic style of Christian belong that is very attractive and magnetic. I think we
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't underestimate that. Like that there's something very powerful and compelling about it. And I don't want to dismiss, while recognizing that there's some real dangerous edges to that, I don't want to dismiss and say, oh, that's a false form of Christianity. It's obviously a very attractive form of Christianity to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to the question what you mentioned about an alternative church governance sort of model, because I think that is like that's a very central part of the aspect of how these networks that you detail in the book really function and everything. But I want to also make sure that I understand. So is there a sort of very clear distinction between what started to develop in the 1970s to today and sort of the antecedents before that, as far as the way in which charismatic movements are studied or even the way in which they function? Like is that did they that's where they started to really change into, if not their exact present form, at least that's where those changes are rooted, is in the 70s? Because it feels like that's a confluence with the major changes that also happened within broader evangelicalism. A lot of things shifted, at least politically. There was a lot of things, historically and theologically, that built the groundwork for what happened starting in the 70s. But that just seems like an interesting coincidence there.
The 70s were very, very important for charismatic Christians. That was really a moment of great energy. I'd actually back the story up a little bit though, because what really gives shape to that non-denominational charismatic space was a revival that kicked off in 1948 in Saskatchewan, Canada. It was Pentecostal revival. It originated within denominational Pentecostalism. It was called the Latter Rain, sometimes the New Order of the Latter Rain. And the energy around it was, this is about 40 years into the start of Pentecostalism. Many of original leaders of Pentecostalism are dying off. And there's this sense we need a new renewal. We need a new revival. But it's in that Latter Rain movement, which spread around the world. I mean, even churches like Hillsong, that many people think of as this like Australian phenomenon, right? That's something outside the U.S. Even those folks were driven and inspired by Latter Rain ideas. And the Latter Rain, one of the central things that they focused on was a passage in Ephesians chapter 4, where the author of Ephesians writes about these 5 gifts that Jesus gives to the church: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And so the Latter Rain people are looking at that and saying, well, we have evangelists, we have pastors, we have teachers, but where are the apostles and prophets? And because they believe in modern prophecy, and this is common within Pentecostalism, they believe that there are prophets today who are speaking the word of God. These prophets started saying, in the 20th century, you'll see the rebirth of the offices, apostles and prophets. And this became then this set of ideas around changing the model of church governance kept percolating in these non-denominational charismatic circles. It became kind of this dream of if we could have apostles and prophets again, we could realign the church, create the revival that we need, and we're just waiting on God to do that. And it really is in the 1970s and 1980s that you actually have people starting to step forward, including like Mike Bickle, who is notorious today for the scandals around the International House of Prayer. But Mike Bickle
Mm-hmm.
in the 1980s was gathering a group of these prophets inspired by these Latter Rain ideas. They're called the Kansas City prophets because they were in Kansas City. They were trying to pioneer and step into some of these roles. And Peter Wagner comes along and really kind of capitalizes on these existing currents. He did not come up with many of the ideas of the New Apostolic Reformation. They were already there in the ether, in
Mm-hmm.
this infinite charismatic space, and then he's picking up using them. And we'll just note, there's a real difference between denominational belonging and at the like individual level, it might not feel that different, but there's very different experience of denominational evangelicalism versus non-denominational evangelicalism, particularly this charismatic non-denominational evangelical. It's just a whole different ethos. And I think it's contiguous enough. Evangelicals who come from denominational backgrounds might be able to feel at home there. But once you separate yourself out from denominational governance, suddenly it's the Wild West, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it really becomes about the leaders and where they want to take things and how far they're willing to push things. And the charismatic piece, I think, adds another layer or another element, experimentation, especially when you believe in modern prophecy, that can take you in some pretty wild direction.
Yeah. And I think that might be a good way to introduce back into discussion this concept that you mentioned of alternative church governance, because really, it's very authoritarian. It's a single person, whether they're an apostle or a prophet, that has direct con, direct control and power over whichever churches are subordinate to them. And I am really blanking on the pastor in the moment in the moment right now as we're rolling. I'm blanking on the pastor who I think was an Asian immigrant who has
Che On.
hundreds or thousands of churches.
Che On.
Jay On, thank you. And he was such a powerful example in the book of someone who has this direct authority over all of these churches throughout a huge geographic swath. So, if you could explain just how that sort of power dynamic works and the way in which they govern, and I do sort of feel like govern and oversee. Oversee is probably more of the churchy term, I suppose, but um, how they sort of guide and control their churches.
Yeah. So in the 1990s, C. Peter Wagner, who's a seminary professor at Fuller, at my alma mater, he kind of gathers a group of these charismatic leaders that he's getting to know. Many of them already steeped in these latter rain ideas, which by that point were starting to be called the fivefold ministry, right? Because there's 5 different offices or identities of leaders that are identified in Ephesians 4. And Wagner started gathering these folks, and together they kind of coined this term, New Apostolic Reformation, in 1996, because they were imagining we could just get these apostles in place with the leadership of prophets around them. That will trigger the 21st century revival that we've all been talking about and prophesying. And what they formed is a style of leadership that has elements of authoritarianism, the kind of central leaders who hear definitively from God and guide the churches. There's an element of oligarchy to it as well. And that's what I'm trying to get at some in the book is I think many times people, when they talk about the NAR, they talk about, oh, well, cult. Peter Wagner is the founder of a cult. There's all these other cult leaders. I don't think that's actually the model that we're talking about here. What we're talking about is more collaborative group of leaders who all want power collectively, but who recognize that no one of them can hold it entirely. And so they all have these kind of authoritarian ambitions. And what Wagner created in the New Apostolic Reformation is a structure, a framework that could hold all these different non-denominational, ambitious, frankly, egotistical leaders together, collaborating. And he claimed that this was actually the model of the early church. He claimed that this was how the apostles in the early church operated. They all had collective authority, and then they exercised that from the top down. Now, query whether that's actually the model of the New Testament. I would argue that's quite a bastardization of the ecclesiology of the New Testament. But nonetheless, this is Wagner's claim. And so Che On and a number of these leaders are in Wagner's immediate circle, and his closest mentees pick up on this. Frankly, they have proven enormously successful, enormously popular, and there's something about this fivefold ministry, apostles and prophet thing that really scratches where charismatics itch. I think that it's in part because charismaticism, its core, is about power and about the experience, right? It's about the power of God flowing through you in these kind of supernatural manifestations, the miraculous power of God flowing through you to heal and change the world. but then it's also about that internal experience. And when somebody comes along and says, "Hey, I'm an apostle. I hear directly from God. I have my advisors who are telling me the direct words of God. I'm going to prophesy over you, or I'm going to commission your church part of this global apostolic movement." It's very, very compelling about that. I think especially for evangelicals who might feel like, "Oh, I'm just part of this non-denominational church. It's kind of boring. We like our
Hmm.
pastor, but we're not really part of a bigger thing." What they've done is added this kind of bigger vision to the non-denominational experience and saying, here's the future trend of the church. And honestly, this fivefold ministry thing globally has just taken off in the last 20 years in a way that if I had not studied the movement, I would say you're crazy to talk about it having that kind of scale. It's
Right.
taking over a huge swath of the global church, a huge swath of the American church. Trumpism became an accelerant for that in a way I would never have predicted.
Hmm. Yeah, and do you think that that is? Do you think that the sort of personal appeal is just that it attaches people to a larger story, that it's empowering, that it's like this sort of mythical, and I mean that I don't mean that disparagingly. I mean like aspirational, inspirational. Like a myth is something that inspires and motivates. That it connects people to that, and that's like sort of, I guess, in increasing secularism sort of studies, people talk about like disenchantment, modern disenchantment. Is this seen as a sort of re-enchantment of the world by some people, or is that like too disparaging, or uh, a way too dismissive to characterize that personal sort of reaction that you were talking about?
No, I think there's definitely an element of re-enchantment built into even Pentecostalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
This sense that truthfully, this also is all built around a certain evangelical instinct that often gets called restorationism. The idea
Mm-hmm.
if we could the experience of the early church, then we would have a pure church. There's something
Mm-hmm.
about purity of the early church, which if you go and read the New Testament, the early church was not that pure of a place, right? There
No.
was conflict, there was fights, there was theological disagreement,
Right.
but there, as you said, there's a mythology of pristine early church that if we could just tap into the energy and experience of the early church, that will purify and renew Christianity, and we can restore Christianity to its original vision, right? So I think that's a big part of it. It syncs with that instinct for restorationism. Frankly, I think there's an element of it that is it's re-enchantment on bath salts, right? It's like this, like we're just gonna like re-enchant you on a weekly or daily basis with
Yeah.
this hunger for miraculous. I mean, I write a little bit about Bethel Church and the Bethel movement
Mm-hmm.
in the book, which is kind of adjacent to and overlapping with parts of the NAR. And I mean, at Bethel, they want miracles for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Right.
There's this sense that if you're really tapped in to who God is, you're just be experiencing the miraculous all the time. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's something about it speaks to that need for re-enchantment, but almost in a way that is manic and really over the top.
Mm. Mm-hmm. And what is it like? You mentioned that if you hadn't been a student of this, and following these developments, that you'd be surprised. What on that note, why do these movements, even though they're so prevalent, even though hundreds of millions of people are swept up in them, why does it seem like it often just gets overlooked by the general public, or by the media that sort of covers things like this? Is it just because their attention is elsewhere, or do these leaders actually employ something that makes them sort of go under the radar, so to speak, even though they have these massive audiences? They're under the radar of other people's awareness.
I think it's similar to the Trump phenomenon in the, there's been an elite establishment in multiple sectors has wanted to turn a blind eye to the Pentecostal charismatic phenomena. And so then that elite kind of ignorance or kind of studied ignorance is in academia. There's very few scholars who study Pentecostalism who did not grow up Pentecostal, and
Mm.
and so even Pentecostal studies, it's connected to evangelical studies, is somehow distinct, and there's a disconnect there. Then with the media, most people who become reporters, if they have any religious background, are probably coming from more mainline Protestant or Catholic traditions, and so this is not in their kind of experiential wheelhouse. And even
Hmm.
within evangelicalism, for a long time, I would argue from the 1940s until the 2010s, there was this kind of elite Colorado Springs Christian university, Christian publishing industries were wanting to define evangelicalism as a certain, very much modeled on a Southern Baptist style of evangelicalism. To think that Southern Baptists are the median evangelicals or the normative evangelicals, everyone else kind of defines themselves in relation to that. This stuff was always popular. It was always growing. It was always engaging large audiences of people. It was doing it in this more kind of populist hinterlands style. I mean, you think of the healing revivals of the 1950s were extremely popular. I mean, or the televangelists when they start emerging in the 1960s and 1970s are reaching global audiences, and yet there's
Hmm.
a certain disdain for that, as though it's kind of lowbrow or too appealing to experience, and oh no, we're kind of rational evangelicals, right? So I think there has been this studied blindness, Pentecostal and charismatic folks, that has led to the blind spot culturally that we towards this stuff. And I think if you go and study Christianity in Africa, Christianity in South America, you're gonna find this stuff all over the place. Probably see it as more integrated into the Christianity. And yet in the United States, there's this sense of like, oh, that's kind of fringy. It's not fringy anymore, for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. All right. Now let's transition to Trump and sort of the way in which he intersects with this world. Um, your book talks about the sort of connections with figures like Paula White Cain and a number of others, and that he seems to have found even early on in his first campaign a lot of resonance and camaraderie with that particular set of Christianity. I'm going to give you like a really long runway with this lead up to a question because I do want to talk about sort of Trump's first term, but I do want to eventually get to what we're sort of seeing today within the first. We're talking on February 19th, late in the evening. Trump's not even been in office a month, and things have been quite chaotic and eventful. So your book really does not try. Your book does a very good job of helping to make sense of how January 6th happened. Um, and I'm so feel free to answer this however you like. But I'm very curious about how you ended up doing your research and also how you just started to develop this timeline of his initial um his in, his initial campaign and presidency, then leading up to what we saw in January 6th, and how the charismatic movement and the NAR in particular really became a part of Trump's propaganda and Trump's attempt to overthrow the election and the eventual insurrection on January 6th. And that's a very big, so feel free to take that whichever route you want.
So, growing up where I grew up and being an evangelical background person who studies evangelicalism, I was hazily aware of some of this stuff. But like
Hmm.
many people, many analysts, I was living through the first Trump presidency in a perpetual state of befuddlement because like the evangelicals who surrounded Trump, I didn't recognize them. I mean, obviously there's James Dobson and some of those folks who were kind of hangers on, who wound
Mm-hmm.
supporting Trump that I understood and was familiar with. But there's this whole other cast of characters around Trump that when I tried to look them up, I'm like, these people are not the evangelicals I knew growing up. And
Mm-hmm.
then January 6th happened, and um, I was mortified by January 6th. My first book is about 9/11 and the impact it had on the American Muslim community, this particular sect of Islam called Salafism in the United States. And so I'd been spent years studying how Muslims in America experienced 9/11 as Americans, seeing their religious tradition, the symbolism weaponized against their culture and their country. I experienced January 6th as a sort of 9/11 of evangelicalism. Seeing
Mm-hmm.
evangelical symbols, evangelical music, evangelical Bible references, evangelical leaders weaponizing the evangelical tradition attack on American democracy. And I, I was just fascinated and curious and start trying to look, okay, who are the Christians who were there? I started digging into Facebook feeds and looking at people, and I started recognizing, oh, there's a certain set of leaders that just keep showing up in references to January 6th. There's a certain set of symbols. There's a certain set of rhetorical markers you can find perpetually throughout. And even the title of my book, The Violent Taken by Force, people were this is Matthew 11:12. It's from the mouth of Jesus, and he's speaking about persecution of his cousin John, because he says, "Since the days of John the Baptist, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force." I still don't know quite what Jesus meant by that. The people around January 6th are constantly referencing that verse as as a sort of man for
Mm-hmm.
why they need to resist. And so as I started digging, I kept coming back to there's a certain set of leaders. And then when I traced those leaders back, they all were connected to Peter Wagner. And then when I kept tracing them back with Trump, I started realizing, oh, some of these were the first leaders, the first Christian leaders to meet with Donald Trump. These are some of the
Yeah.
first people enter into his religious advisory circle. Actually, some of the most prominent of his religious advisors were central to what happened on January 6th. It was not like incidental. These were wild, fringy characters. These were some of Trump's closest advisors that were then integrally involved in January 6th. And so and the more that I dug into all these databases, all the social media, all the kind of history of these folks, the more I started recognizing, oh, there's this kind of golden thread of the New Apostolic Reformation is there at the very beginning of Trump phenomenon, the Trump political phenomenon in 2015, all the way through January 6th, and truly until today. I mean, there's this entwinement of Trump New Apostolic Reformation that I think is actually very integral understanding Trump's appeal to Christians.
Hmm. I'm not that it's such a weighty thing, even years later, and even also just living through the subsequent 2024 election and the realities of what's happening politically, even as we're recording. Sort of putting my mind back into January 6th is always it always sort of makes me, I have to pause. I don't know. And just it's just one of those world historical events that makes you disappear back into your mind. So I apologize for the blip there. But when we eventually get to January 6th, and everything that sort of came after it, um, if you could talk a little bit about the way in which some of the media aspects and the way in which the NAR spreads its messages across the various networks, whether it's a particular apostle or prophet, and how those networks functioned in a way to actually even inspire and get people to the Capitol that day. Because to me, that like that is fascinating in a sort of morbid way. You know, what can motivate someone to take that level of action? So I'm curious what your experience writing this book details about that.
Yeah, I think there are three elements of NAR theology that you have to understand the backstory of January 6th. So one is the central leadership of apostles and prophets, this kind of spiritual oligarch apostles and prophets that we've already talked about. Another one is their theology of spiritual warfare. And this gets started in the 1990s. Wagner and his kind of cohort of leaders really pioneer all these new paradigms of spiritual warfare in the 1990s. Very, very popular in evangelicalism. If you think that was going on in the 1990s, right? The Frank Peretti novels, This Present Darkness and Piercing the Darkness, came out at the end of the 1980s, kind of inspired this new imaginary of the kind of spiritual demonology of evangelicalism. And Wagner
He
and the NAR
he
piggyback
was
off that.
he spoke at I'm sorry, he was a commencement speaker at my graduation.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, anyways, continue.
So they come up with all these new ways of thinking about spiritual warfare as a kind of collective mobilization, military sensibility. And then they think the apostles and prophets are generals of spiritual warfare who can organize mass campaigns of spiritual warfare. And they layer these paradigms of spiritual warfare onto the American landscape. Everything is either demonic or angelic. Everything is either part of the kingdom of God or the kingdom of Satan. And so it creates this kind of binary. Every politician is lined up in some way. Every party is lined up in some way. Every institution is lined up in some way. And then the third piece is the Seven Mountain. And this was not originally part of the New Apostolic Reformation when Wagner first conceived of it. But right around 2001, Lance Wallnau, who was also an independent charismatic person, also deeply ensconced in these latter rain ideas, claimed that he got this kind of prophecy about imagining society as seven mountains, these seven spheres of influence, and that Christians were supposed to take the tops of all these mountains, the religion mountain, the government mountain, the education mountain. And when Wagner integrates that into the New Apostolic Reformation and brings Wallnau into his inner circle, this becomes part of the radicalizing of this New Apostolic Reformation thing. It starts out like, we're going to reform the church, we're going to change all these things. And then the Seven Mountains comes in and introduces some of these dominion theology paradigms that were already kind of percolating in Wagner's circle, but really kind of crystallizes it. And the Seven Mountains really, I think, accelerates NAR on this political trajectory, because suddenly they have this ambition. We're not just going to reform the church, we're going to take over the world. We're going to transform whole societies. We're going to disciple nations, as they would put it in their interpretation of the Great Commission. And so I think when you put all those things together, but as Trump gets kind of wedded to some of these NAR and other charismatic things, there starts to be all these prophecies. This starts, within a month of Donald Trump entering the presidential race, you already start having prophecies about him being published on Charismatic. And charismatic media is the other piece that you have to think about, because there's an entire media ecosystem that exists that speaks to charismatics. And if you're not a part of it, you would never know that it's there. But it's huge. It's massive. Right. Charisma News, Charisma Magazine, all these televangelism channels, YouTube prophecy channels. It is this gargantuan media infrastructure that millions of people are watching and paying attention to. And and so these prophecies start getting carried through all of these media channels. And by the time of the 2020 election, there were hundreds of these prophecies, and they were all speaking in unison. All these individual prophets, but all claiming that God had told them individually that Donald Trump was God's chosen candidate for the 2020 election. And we also need to think about, though, in there, especially in this NAR space, but really in the charismatic space in general, prophecy is not understood in a kind of Calvinist predetermined way. They think of prophecy as God is revealing God's preference, God's will. You have this element of spiritual warfare, right? Satan is trying to thwart God's will. And so prophecies are not self-fulfilling. That you have to make the prophecies come to pass. And so
it's not fate. It's not fate.
And so when Trump is declared the loser 2020 and refuses to concede, you have this chorus of these hundreds of prophets all saying, well, I'm not taking back my prophecy. We need a miracle. We know what God wants. We know God wants Trump to be there. Now we need to do spiritual warfare. And the apostles and prophets push themselves out to the front, adopt all these media vehicles like Flashpoint, like Sheets Give Him 15, all these different kind of existing or new modes of communicating about these prophecies and really amping it up and amping it up and amping it. Right, and this is what leads to the Jericho marches. That if you remember back to 2020, these kind of weird spiritual warfare gatherings that are leading up to January 6th. Right? There's this groundswell of spiritual warfare around Trump. We need to fulfill the prophecies. We know God's will. We need to do battle. And this gets entwined with all these conspiracy theories Trump and his inner circle are pushing out on all the Stop the Steal campaign. This is, I would say, the spiritual side of the Stop the Steal campaign, very much driven by these prophecy narrative, these NAR leaders. And some of these folks were interfacing directly with Michael Flynn, with Alex Jones, with people that I think many of us would identify as, whoa, those are kind of really out there political characters. Well, they're also talking to apostles and prophets. And I document in the book as well how much access some of these folks had to the White House and these kind of secret meetings that were going on internal to the White House between AR apostles and prophets and Trump administration officials January 6th. And then on January 6th, I traced more than 60 charismatic leaders who were in Washington, D.C. for January 6th, including a large chunk of the NAR inner circle who were there. And I found, even among the NAR leaders who weren't there, almost across the board, they were supportive, contributing to the Stop the Steal. It was it was not hyper coordinated or centralized effort. They all had the same theology. They all bought into that theology, and then they all kind of jumped on the Trump train and the Stop the Steal effort because they saw it as both a spiritual opportunity and a spiritual crisis.
Well, now we find ourselves in another Trump administration, and I know that's very much a hard pivot, but it was his 2024 victory is due in no small part to the consistent support that he received because of the fact that the insurrection became the big lie, which propelled and maintained this belief even if you look at polling of just Republicans in general, that a considerable percentage still believe that the 2020 election was stolen. But now we find ourselves in a new Trump administration. What did this same sort of charismatic support look like during the last campaign? And really, the main question I have for you now is, given that he won again in 2024, are these sort of more moderate evangelicals, are they sidelined in preference for this type of Christian support by Trump and his allies and those in his administration? Or is there still an alliance between those types of not just voters but leaders in particular, the people that whether they're prophets in these movements or on the more run-of-the-mill evangelical side, just the standard set of characters in that space in DC and elsewhere?
Yeah, when I first started working on this research, it probably took me about a year to even figure out what I was looking at, and really get a sense for, these are the actual leaders of the NAR, because it's a very hard movement to track because there's not a ton of official records and there's not a ton of institutional footprint, right? It's mostly the relationships among the leaders that structures it. And when I got to that point of realizing, I think I understand something about January 6th I have not seen described anywhere, this could be an interesting book. I was thinking mostly as a historical piece, like, how did we get to January 6th? And then as we got into 2022, I started to realize, oh no, this is happening again. This is not like, this is an interesting footnote to January 6th. This is going on right now. And so I put out a podcast series called Charismatic Revival Fury, and then this book in part wanted to warn people, highlight, because just did not see this cognizance of how much evangelicalism was changing under our feet, along with these bizarre politics between 2021 and 2024. I think New Apostolic Reformation, but really what has happened in the wake of January 6th is you've had this cadre of independent charismatic leaders who come out of the woodwork, become the frontline captain of Christian nationalism and of MAGA Christianity in the United States. And this is happening at a local level with people taking over school boards. This is happening often citing the Seven Mountains, right? We need to take the education mountain. We need to take government mountain in our local context. It's happened through Turning Point USA, which has entirely restructured itself around the Seven Mountains. It's happened through these kind of grassroots, independent, charismatic celebrity networks that are suddenly all these pastors who suddenly pop out and say, "I'm now a political activist. I'm now going to start pushing this stuff." And so there are hundreds of people, not all of them connected to the historic NAR, but very much inspired by this kind of NAR style of theology and political activism, and now kind of emerging. And what it's done is completely changed the landscape of American evangelicalism, to the point where today, I mean, a colleague of mine, Paul Jupe, and I ran a survey in early 2021, and we found we asked people about 6 or 7 different statements of NAR theology. I would have characterized fringe before the Trump era. Almost all of them, 6 out of 7, got more than 50% approval among evangelicals.
Wow.
And so I wouldn't necessarily say that all those evangelicals are NAR. Most of them would never even know what you meant if you said, "Are you NAR?" They wouldn't even understand the terminology. But the ideas that come out of the NAR circles have radicalized a vast swath of American Christians around Trump, around these prophecies, around this kind of ecstatic spirituality, has this political dimension to it. And I think it's theology that is kind of ready-made for sort of fascist authoritarianism. And Trump, well, it kind of met the moment, and theology met him, right? And all of these things kind of have converged. So the NAR was extremely involved in the 2024 election. Lance Wallnau ran functionally a voter mobilization campaign disguised as a revival campaign in the swing states, and in direct coordination with the Trump. And you have all these prophecies continuing to be released. And when these assassination attempts happened against Trump, that just gave rocket fuel to the prophecy narrative. I mean, I was tracking Christian leaders who were coming out of more mainstream, kind of conventional evangelical backgrounds who were like, "I didn't believe in any of these prophecies before, but now, after the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, I believe," right? And so,
which is wild because they probably read the Left Behind books, and I mean that was a big part of the Left Behind books. That guy gets shot, and then he comes back.
Well, and that's the thing, like, ability to override some of the premillennial instincts that were so deeply ingrained in evangelicalism, right? Because the NAR, some of them are premillennial, but they are not dispensational. These are not rapture believers. These are Christians who have more of a kind of post-millennial, we need to take over the world sensibility.
Right.
And that, I would say that has spread into all these different forms of evangelicalism. I would say, if you want to think of it as a sort of theological cancer, which I think it is, right? This cancer of Christian Trumpism that wants to marry evangelical spirituality with this kind of fascist understanding of a messianic political figure. I think that begins within the independent charismatic space and has spread. It's spread in Calvary Chapel. It's spread into denominational Pentecostals. It's spread into the Southern Baptists. I mean, to the point where all these folks who would have laughed the NAR leaders out of the room 15 years ago are now in lockstep with them. And and Trump has learned to speak the language of prophecy. If you noticed on his victory speech on election night, he referenced the assassination attempts and said, "God spared me." In his inaugural, he talked about, "God spared my life to make America great again." Now, whether Trump believes any of that, I have no idea. But he's learned to speak that idiom, appeal to folks in a way that he did not have that skill set in 2016. He was bumbling in 2016 and was really propped up by his religious advisors. Now he's gained more of a religious vocabulary. I don't think you get the results of the 2024 election without these prophecies, because that was a huge part of the disinformation, ensconcing these conspiracy theories, built. It was kind of the transmission vehicle for these conspiracy theories into evangelicalism. By the time of the 2024 election, a third of the country believed that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. And among white evangelicals, it was closer to 2/3. Right? A third of the country coming into this election was living in unreality. And you don't have the return of Donald Trump from the complete ignominy and shame that he was experiencing post January 6th without these leaders vouching for him again, without them using new prophecies, without them selling the conspiracy theories. And I mean, we are today in an epistemic crisis, American society. We're in a political crisis, we're in a governance crisis, we're also in this epistemic crisis. How do we even know what we know? What are the sources of information that prophecies around Trump, conspiracy theories around Trump have made that all the more dangerous and all the more discombobulating to the average American?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And for my final one or two questions, these are certainly open-ended questions. These are not ones but I'm very curious, even in this very volatile moment that we're in, as we face multiple simultaneous crises, as you mentioned, we are sort of seeing instances of people attacking, like Mike Flynn attacking Lutheran groups for receiving government grants in order to provide humanitarian aid. So we're seeing instances of them essentially saying the quiet part loud, and that I think that a lot of people that have been in these spaces, whether they're evangelical or charismatic, a lot of these spaces tend to discount the validity of the faith of other Christians, whether they're mainline or Catholic or what have you, and that definitely seems to be emphasized and it was amplified by Elon Musk, who, to my knowledge, has no real religious convictions. Though he said he's culturally Christian or something like that in recent months. But nonetheless, we see this sort of open animus and political targeting of other, even Christian groups. And then it gets more complex than that and goes beyond sort of the scope of our conversation, and that, ICE is trying to raid churches and individual pastors, as well as church denominations are pushing back against that at the institutional and legal level, as well as at the local level, and trying to deny these efforts by ICE and other agencies. So we're seeing all of this sort of happen, whether it's directly within the Trump administration, or by those in these sort of legally nebulous but adjacent places like Doge, or even just these champions of the cause like Mike Flynn, making these public statements. As someone whose focus is on interreligious dialogue, interreligious studies, I'm very curious how you're starting to think about the ways in which various religious groups, whether they're denominations or what have you, or interreligious groups, can partner amongst each other, as well as finding alliances and forging alliances with more secular Americans and more secular people who are non-religious. I mean, a lot of my focus is talking to people who've left evangelicalism, and generally they split between people who find another faith expression and those who don't. I mean, it's an uneven split, but typically those groups don't talk to each other. And it feels like we're at this point where we need to talk to each other. We need to find alliances based on shared values, and really meet this moment in a very important way. So I'm not trying to say to tee you up for some like hackneyed give me some hope sort of stuff. Hope is an action. Hope is a choice in my mind. So but I am very curious, given that this is your work. This is what you spend the day thinking about. You're the sort of person we should be talking to, right? So how what are you thinking about what you're seeing in the way that these things are playing out, and what are some potential strategies that can be pursued by whichever group to really try to resist this?
Yeah, let me start by just commenting on where you started with the way they're this Christian nationalism is being weaponized against Christians, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it really exposes the lie, the heart of Christian nationalism. That, oh, this is about freedom for Christians. It's about religious freedom, or oh, it's about protect
Mm-hmm.
Christians. No, no, it's about protecting your kind of Christian. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is, best definition I know of authoritarianism is it's the subordination of truth to power. And then when you press it even further into forms of fascism, it's the inversion of truth, right? The ministry of truth is the propaganda, falsehood
Mm-hmm.
ministry, right? And I think in many ways that lie has become so much more since Trump came back into office. The weaponization of ICE against churches, right? What happened to all that religious freedom talk? Those churches don't have the right to protect their own sanctuary and protect the people within them. What
Mm-hmm.
happened? This oh we need to use Christian charity to change the world. Okay, well you're stripping all this money away from Christian charities, right? And so um, the obsession with power. I think we also need to distinguish between the Christian right of old and the Christian far right of today. Because the Christian
Mm-hmm.
right of old, I have a lot of criticisms of it. I have a lot of problems with it. I grew up in that world. It had misogyny and racism. It had it had its own authoritarian tendencies, but it was quite comfortable with democracy, and it was trying to do this kind of grassroots transformation of society. What we are seeing right now is the advent of Christian far right, and it's not only the Apostolic Reformation, independent charismatics. You also have this really radical kind of Calvinist a wing of the Christian supremacy, Christian far right. You have this radical traditionalist Catholic, J.D. Vance kind of camp. So
Mm-hmm.
there's multiple spurs of this thing that are all kind of converging around Trump. But no, the Christian far right, their cause is Trump. It's not Christianity anymore. Their cause is Trump, and they don't see any daylight between MAGA and Christianity because they are so in hot, so devoted to him with this quasi messianic fervor. They, they don't think to criticize him. They don't think to challenge him. They don't think to even press him. They're not a lobbying group anymore. They're a propaganda wing. And,
Mm-hmm.
and I think once you realize that, it helps to understand how they can be completely content with ICE raiding churches, even evangelical churches, with stripping funding from Christian charities are operating Christian NGOs that are operating overseas through USAID, because it's about vindicating and justifying him. In terms of resistance, I think I have two thoughts to share. One is we need to build biggest possible coalition without purity tests, without getting into the petty rivalries that often dominate the political left and the political center. The truth is that 1/3 of the country that came into the election believing that Trump won the 2020 election, for all intents and purposes, they're gone. They've left reality. They might come back a decade from now, but they're not coming back anytime soon. And they will never abandon Trump. He could blow up the economy. He could start World War III. They would still be supporting him. And so we need, and the other reality is, if Trump follows the authoritarian playbook, which he has every indication of doing so far into his term, elections only get harder from here, because part of the authoritarian playbook is to consolidate power in such a way that you will never lose, your party will never lose another election. And so we need to build a supermajority coalition. And if you think of the other 66% of the country, it's about 5% out of that 66%. So 10% total of a coalition is non-Christian other religions, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, and then about 45% of it's secular. It's nuns, right? It's the people who've left the church. And the other 45%
Mm-hmm.
are other Christians, Christians of color, white, progressive Christians. So we need to forge a coalition that unites all of those parts of of American society. And we need atheists, we need Buddhists, we need Muslims, we need Christians of goodwill to come together. I think it has to be about not just restoring American democracy to what it was before, but reforming American democracy. The reality is, people voted for Trump because they were disillusioned with our democracy. We don't need to go back to 2015. We need to reformulate American democracy and put forward a vision of American democracy that's more compelling than Trumpism. And then when it comes to Christians, propaganda is theological. And so the response has to be theological. Because if you come back and respond to these NAR prophecies and Trump propaganda and say, well, that's bad Christianity, or, oh, well, those people aren't real Christians, or, oh, well, I just am not going to engage with that because that's against human rights, that's not going to send any. The reality is, Trump is being sold with Christian theology. We need to have a Christian theological resistance movement that stands in the gap and says, this is a bastardization gospel of Jesus Christ. It's not a bastardization of Christianity. It's actually quite in line with a lot of the worst parts of Christianity, of Christian imperialism, Christian colonialism, right? We don't need to be precious about Christianity. Christianity is a human tradition full of all kinds of human deficiencies. But
Mm-hmm.
if we focus on the gospel of Jesus, Jesus was not anyway preaching a gospel of Christian supremacy. He was calling Christians to serve, to be the slave of all. He was preaching a gospel of Christian disempowerment, if anything. And that Christians are here to be in the world in the way that Jesus was in the world, living in such a way that makes your enemies into friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we can present kind of gospel that I think is absolutely true to the mission and teaching of Jesus, I think that will be a very compelling alternative. But we have to find our theological voices to do that. I think we need our Muslim and Jewish and atheist friends in that coalition to recognize we as Christians have a responsibility and a role to resist this using theology in a way that they don't. And I think they need to be okay with that. But we also need to be okay that they aren't the ones to make those arguments. That's us. That's on us to argue theologically and to find some theological spine. We also need their partnership in that. And part of what we have to do is humanize them to our fellow Christians and say, okay, I understand you've got this idealism about Christian power. What about your Jewish neighbors? What about your Muslim, atheist neighbors? Do you really want to see them be second-class citizens in the society? Do you really want to see their rights stripped away? And what about your progressive Christian friends who are now having their churches raided by ICE? Do you really want that in our society? I think that's the mandate from here on out. And I think you're right. Hope is, if it's premised on nothing, is silly.
Mm-hmm.
If we can have the mentality of most people in history have not had the privilege of living in a world democracy, and they've had to fight for their rights, had to stand against dictators, and they've had to walk in the complicated politics of this world that are not preserved around freedom and human rights. And so we're in good company. We need to find inspiration from the resistance movements, not just Christian inspiration, but the resistance movements within Islam, within Judaism, within Buddhism, within Hinduism. We can take inspiration from them, but we need to find a Christian theological voice that dismantles the propaganda of Christian Trumpism, because we don't get out of this without that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for those thoughts. That's a great note to end on. It definitely is these days are, there's always something to learn about, and to sort of react to. But I always like finding something that to latch onto that we can also be a bit proactive within whatever our capacity is. to do. There's an old Wesleyan women. There's like a group called the Wesleyan Women, and so they do what we can, doing what we can when we can. And like it's sort of, it's we used to joke about it in our house, but now we're like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
You know, it sounds a lot like a saying of the rabbis where they talk about, it's not in your capacity to finish the work, but neither are you
Yeah.
allowed to give it up. Right.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
think we need to think about this as a multi-generational effort to restore and reform American democracy to something better than it was before. Just one last point in terms of something very, very practical you can do. Donald Trump got fewer votes in 2024 than he did in 2020, which means the opposition was not mobilized. And there were a lot of people who could have voted who chose not to. I think we just need to make it a normal part of our interactions when we're encountering new people who we don't really know, and we're trying to kind of feel them out and hear who they are, to ask, are you a voter? And to make that a normal part of conversation. You're not asking the balance of their bank account. You're not telling them they have to vote in a particular way. Are you a voter? Because if you're not, don't complain. Become part of the solution. Because there's a part of the American population that just simply does not vote. And I think we need to try to tap into those people and say, this is your project too.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Taylor, thank you very much for joining me for this discussion. Where can people find your work online? Anything else you want to mention here?
Yeah, so I work at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, icjs.org. We're a nonprofit, and all of our programs are available to the public. Most of them are actually online, many of them on our YouTube channel if you want to go back and see our back catalog. I just taught a course on Christian theologies of power and resistance, a 3-part course that is all on YouTube if you're interested in kind of seeing some of how I'm thinking about where to find these inspirations for resistance in the tradition. I'm also on Twitter, Blue Sky, Substack, Threads, all the places.
All the spots.
Yeah, happy to follow.
Yeah. And again, the book is The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy. Matthew, thank you very much for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Blake.